growing trend in sports nutrition is that every athlete's body is unique. At the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, we are working to help athletes and their influencers better understand these differences so they can better fuel their bodies. GSSI has a variety of tools to accomplish this, from testing the unique attributes of each athlete to nutrition personalization programs and educational outreach. GSSI is striving to make sure athletes and their influencers are more informed about their nutritional needs than ever before. GSSI is also an educational resource for sports health professionals, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, registered dietitians and sports scientists all turn to GSSI to gain insights into the latest research and strategies that they can put to use with their own athletes. Whether it's in the lab or on the field, online or offline, GSSI is giving athletes and their influencers an invaluable look at how nutrition and hydration can change their game, help them reach their goals, and become the best they can be.
Hi everyone, welcome to the 5th GSSI Fuel School. Thanks to everyone who is joining us today. If you've attended previous webinars, you will definitely know who I am by now, but for any new attendees, I am Dr. Rebecca Randall. I've been working with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for 8 years, and I'm currently a senior scientist. As I have been in previous sessions, I will be moderating this one, so please ask any questions you have through the Q&A box. Just type them in and I'll ask them to the speakers when we have time for the Q&A at the end of the session. So just to give you some background about GSSI, our long-standing mission is to help athletes globally optimize their health and performance through research and education in hydration and nutrition science. At GSSI, we work under 4 main pillars, which are education, research, innovation, and athlete service. And these webinars are related to our education pillar with the aim to educate more sports professionals than ever. And obviously we cannot meet in person due to the challenging times that we're all facing at the moment. So this virtual platform is a great way to provide sports nutrition presentations. Today we will be focusing on all things basketball and we have a very full agenda. Our speakers are Dr. Jose Canlas, Mark Jerram, Adrian van der Ploeg and Fran Baldwin. Dr. start talking nutrition for basketball players, and then Mark, Adrian and Fran will combine to talk about all things coaching, strength and conditioning and nutrition, and touching upon their experiences working with top basketball players. Once all of our speakers have presented, we'll then get stuck into the Q&A. So let's begin. Our first speaker, as I just mentioned, is Dr. Canlas. Dr. Canlas is a consultant for GSSI and for the International Basketball Federation. Dr. Canlas has a wealth of experience of working with basketball players, and we're so delighted to have him present today. As I mentioned, Dr. Canlas is going to talk to us about nutrition for basketball players. So I'll pass the stage over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rebecca. First of all, good day to everyone. Thank you for joining us here. I'm honored to my fellow speakers, Adrian, Mark, and Fran. I think my role here is more like my role in international basketball. It's introduce, be a supervisory role, introduce on what Mark, Adrian, and Fran will be more specific about later on. I just want you to know basketball has changed drastically since I've been involved with GSSI in the mid-90s. Now, all we did for GSSI in the mid-90s is a very rudimentary sweat test on the macronutrient level, if ever. Now, with FIBA, we were just involved with injuries. Now, if you're in the sports science section, you're involved with nutrition, with sleep, with travel. And because of the pandemic, the basketball world has changed. Right now, I'm helping the professional league here in the country form their bubble. We're trying to hold the tournament for the next 2 months for 12 teams. They'll be just have one court to practice in, and the same court that they play at night. They'll have 2 games every day. They'll probably be playing every second day. It will be a problem for the health of the players, mental health, strength and conditioning, how to maintain it, and especially nutrition. And hopefully we're able to help out. Can I have the first slide, please? As you know, basketball is a combination of intermittent and high-intensity exercise. On a regular basis, the frequency practice anywhere from 4 to 6 times a week. And then if you're in season, that will drastically change because you'll have 1 or 2 games a week, at the most 3 games a week. It is basically a movement of aerobic and spurts of anaerobic. This is a study by the FIBA in a book they presented in the early 2000s. If you can get hold of this book, it's an IOC book. It's probably the most comprehensive book on basketball so far. And they've seen that in a game, you have 100 changes if you're playing the whole game. Now the duration of the game is anywhere from 40 minutes to 48 minutes actual time, but with a warm up and warm down, and in between you'll be on the court a little more than an hour. It's from walking, jogging, running, jumping, cutting. These are really explosive anaerobic activities, and it's a change every 2 seconds. And if you really knock it down, it's going to be a shuffle, then a simple jog with episodes of sprint, and then your jumps, depending on your position. And as we know now, it's very position-based. And then the walk is less than a third of basketball. Can I have the next slide, please? As you know, we have student teams and we have professionals. The way you deal with them is very different. A typical basketball player is always pressed for time, because you have, in a typical day, you'll have studies, or you have work, and then you'll have strength and conditioning, you have practice, and in between these activities, you have to insert your meals. And I think our goal is to educate our athletes on what food choices will optimize performance. And that performance is basically maximize agility and power for the duration of the game. You have to educate your athletes. Now, this is the fuel used during basketball. Can I have the slide? This is the basketball zone. It's basically at the higher end of your VO2 or your exertion. And since the energy systems here are the ATP and the lactic acid energy systems, it's basically a carbohydrate fueled game. Next slide, please. Again, I say we have to educate our athletes. They have to have enough calories to optimize their performance, whether it's in practice or it's during games. They have to have, some athletes would want to gain weight, so they'll have special meals for them, or special design of meals for them, and some would want to lose weight. And the other part of nutrition is drinking enough fluid. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the typical energy expenditure of a normal person. Next slide. What drains our batteries? Let's say this is our energy for the day. Number 1 will be your resting metabolic rate. What we found out is it's very individualized. Some people have faster metabolic rates, higher metabolic rates than others. And then there are some certain characteristics like hypothyroidism, diabetes. And I don't dissuade our athletes who have this from playing, so you have to consider those. Next slide, please. Your non-exercise activity, you're going up and down the stairs, you're mowing the lawn, you're sitting 2 hours watching to a webinar on basketball. Next slide. Food digestion. Next slide. And then your exercise. For those of you in a country locked down, exercise has either been limited or you've exercised too much. And all these factors basically amount to your total energy expenditure. Can I have the next slide, please? Again, from that IOC book, which they worked with FIBA, these are the recommended amounts to maintain your weight and to provide fuel for basketball. This is basically for basketball, for the males. Yeah, the 209 kilojoules per kilogram per day, and for the females, which is a little lower. But I think right now, the male and female activities are basically the same. So I would put it on the higher end too for female expenditure. This is the expenditure for basketball per minute of exercise. And this is just an example on how you calculate for a 91 kilogram male for 120 minutes of practice. So roughly for a 2-hour practice, you will have spent for just that practice almost 1.5 kilocalories, kilocalories of energy. And those are the things you have to consider when you're forming a nutrition guideline for your players. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Since, like I said earlier, basketball activity is more on the higher end of energy expenditure, the intermittent and high-intensity exercise, we rely on carbohydrates. And as you all know, normal carbohydrate storage is the significant fuel source for the first 90 to 120 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise. Increasing these stores may enhance exercise performance, and reducing these stores corresponds to levels of fatigue, cramps, and maybe even injury. That's why it's very important that I have my players come into practice or come into games well hydrated and with good nutrition. More important, I feel, especially like, let's say we're talking of the bubble, well, you have a game every 2 days, game every other day, is recovery. And I personally think the first 45 minutes is very important for recovery. These are the numbers you have to consider on grams for recovery, for daily recovery. These are the ones that are recommended by the nutrition guidelines in 2016 by Thomas et al. These are for low intensity or skill-based activities, 3 to 5. For moderate exercise programs, that I would say 40 minutes of jogging, cycling, it's 5 to 7. Endurance programs, which are the endurance cycling, triathlons, marathons, 6 to 10. An extreme exercise program where you train 4 to 5 hours a day, it's 8 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. So it's pretty substantial. Next slide, please. For protein, these are what we recommend. Normal activities is 8 to 1.2 kilograms per day, and athletic activities 1.2 to 1.8 kilograms per day. And I think what's important to realize is high quality protein sources are recommended. I know there are like the vegetarians, they try to rely on other sources of protein. I would suggest for the high-end athletes, you would go to the high-quality proteins, the meats, the fish, the eggs, the milk. Maybe on the vegetable side, soy would probably approximate the amount of amino acids in the high-quality proteins. All the others, although I wouldn't take them away from their diet, they're probably lacking some amino acids compared to the high-quality proteins. I know there'll be questions later on this, and we'll try to field them as you ask. Next slide, please. Fat, you would just take 25 to 35% of caloric intake. For basketball players, since the fat utilization in a basketball game is only about 15 to 20%. If you had a meal, I would say a regular meal for a basketball player, more than 50%, 50, 60% will be carbohydrates. I would divide the carbohydrates between starch type. I would rely more on the starch type, the pastas, the rice, the bread, and the others, a little less than 50% will be the juices and the fruits, which are not necessarily very good pre-game food, because they might cause some stomach problems. And then for fat, again, 25 to 35% of caloric intake. And for protein, on a regular meal, I would just say 15 to 20% of your meal should be of protein. And this is high quality protein. Again, this is on a regular meal. If you're thinking of recovery meals, the protein intake, I think, should be a lot bigger, because the protein will be a factor in recovering from injuries and such. Next slide, please. Here we go again. For young athletes, protein, 15 to 20% of total calories should come from protein. For young athletes, maybe we should put a little more protein because they're growing. For fat, 15 to 30%, less than 30%. Carbohydrates, again, because of the character of your game, which is basketball, 50 to 60%. And this is more about 3 to 8 grams per kilogram per day. Micronutrients, though, if your athlete, if your child, if your adolescent has a healthy, balanced diet, I don't think regular supplementation is needed. There's no harm. And I know supplements now is a big business. I work with the IOC, and we've always come out with statements. Most international federations, FIBA also, come out with statements that we really don't recommend supplementation if you have a balanced diet. One is, if you have a balanced diet, you can usually get it from your diet. Second is, we don't know what is in the supplements. If my rule of thumb is, if it helps you, then it's performance enhancing. And if it's performance enhancing, it's probably banned. That's why I stay away from supplements, and I, as much as possible, ask my athletes, basketball players, to stay away from supplements. Next slide, please. For regular athletes, it's a little different. The protein is from whole food sources, high-grade protein sources, meat, eggs, probably soy if you're more of the vegetarian type. After exercise, though, like I said, it is important within the first 45 minutes, within the first 3 hours, to have a high-quality protein just for recovery. For carbohydrates during exercise, it's 30, 60 grams for more than an hour of exercise. And basketball, your practice are 2 to 3 hours a day. So this is what I would base it on. And after exercise with recovery, you have the 1 to 1.5 kilograms of body mass within 30 minutes of exercise session. What I do with my teams is, the moment they're in the locker room, we have a post-game meal. We don't wait for everybody to dress up and go out into the restaurant or into the mess hall. We have it right in the locker room. I've been recommending chocolate milk for the past few years, and I think it's worked for us for recovery, not for pre. For fluids before exercise, it's 4 hours prior to exercise, 5 to 7 milliliters. So that's almost 2 to 3, I'm sorry, yeah, 1 to 2 liters of fluids prior to exercise. During exercise, it depends. I'll show a study later on that sweat loss, body sweat loss, and sodium loss from sweat is very individual. And I think that's why the sweat tests of Gatorade is very important for athletes, not just for individual sports like tennis or athletics, but it helps a lot for basketball. After exercise, for fluids, you have 450, 675 per half a kilogram, and you add the sodium consideration from sweat loss. Again, it is very individualistic. I feel the sweat tests help a lot. Micronutrients, maybe just sodium from the sports drink. Gatorade, I think, is one of my favorites here. Next slide, please. You have to have, especially those who deal with the young athletes, make sure there's a balance and there's variation. Don't let them keep taking the same food always. This is my problem in the bubble right now. For now, because it's just the start of the bubble, we're not letting the individuals eat outside the room. All their meals will be delivered to their room. So it's a fixed amount. If they want more, we'll have to find a mechanism on how to get them more. Variety will be a problem. That's why we'll be feeding 12 teams of 15 people each. So it's going to be a big deal for our organization. And I think because FIBA will be holding bubbles for their home and away, it will also be a change of what we're used to. Next slide, please. Hydration. Next slide. Again, those who've attended previous webinars and some of my lectures on hydration before, you know that it's very important for cardiovascular function, body temperature regulation, and for basketball, I feel it's very important. For the basketball teams I work with, we have definite hydration rules per player. The moment they're taken out of the game, we have particular hydration rules for them. We have certain players that have higher sweat loss than usual, so we'll have a special plan for him. And we've had, in fact, they're professional players now. When we weren't that particular on sodium loss, we actually built some programs for them. My problem is when I'm asked about the hyperosmolar drinks, I feel are not appropriate for basketball, because instead of hydrating, they might actually be dehydrating. And then you have to explain to them why. Next slide, please. For those who work in the tropical country like the Philippines, this is very important because it's usually done in hot and humid gyms. We have very little, we have few gyms where they are air conditioned for practice. Most of our competition gyms are air conditioned, but for practice there are very few. So you have to work with hydration a lot. We cannot rely on the thirst of our athlete, especially in the young ones, to be your measure of hypohydration. You have to be very specific about it, and this is the formula for looking out volume loss or the sweat loss of your athlete. You have the pre-exercise weight in kilograms. You weigh him before your practice. You minus that. You minus the weight after practice in kilograms, and you measured all the fluid intake during practice, and that will basically be the liters of fluid loss. And you want that to be replaced immediately after, or you have to maintain as much during It's a trial and error thing, but right now we can be very specific about it. Next slide, please. Now, this is a study, this is what I mentioned. This is a study by Kelly Barnes in 2019. This is just one of the tables they showed. It's 1,303 athletes tested by GSSI from, I think, 2000 to 2017. They measured the whole body sweat loss and then the rate of sodium sweat loss. And what they found out is, one, it's very individualistic. Not everybody has the same sweat loss. And this is what the slide shows. Some people have sodium loss more than the others. And second, it's very sports specific. Now, because most of these were done, I think, in the United States, their number one athlete, the number one sport that loses whole body sweat would be American football. And then the endurance sports, which is the cycling, the marathon running, the triathlons. And then, believe it or not, basketball. Basketball athletes had a higher whole body sweat loss than soccer or baseball. The other thing they found out is the rate of sodium loss was higher in American football. And I think because most of the American football games are played outside. And more important is, I think American football have all these equipment, protective equipment, that just makes them sweat. And then endurance athletes, and then the sodium sweat loss between soccer, basketball, and baseball are basically the same. Next slide, please. This is a study by Baker, Louis Baker in 2011. They studied the importance of dehydration in basketball players. They did high intensity sports. How do you go about this? What they did is they had 17 athletes, basketball players, 17 to 28 years old. They had them on a treadmill for a while, and then they measured the levels of hydration. They hydrated some of them they did 1% dehydration, some of them they did 2% hydration, and then some of them had 4% dehydration. And what came out? After the hydration, they made them do specific skills, and then they made them shoot baskets, free throws, three-point shots, and foul throws. And this is what came out. With the fully hydrated athletes, they're basically very minimal decrease in performance, in skills and shots. At 2%, though, they started to deteriorate. And at 4%, they were really slow compared to the fully hydrated athletes. So in this study, they've decided that at 2% dehydration, your shooting skills, your cuts, your slides are going to be slower than if you're fully dehydrated. Next slide, please. These are the hydration tips. And the left side would be your urine, the color of your urine, and these are the colors that are ideal. For mildly dehydrated, and I would say this is from 1 to 2%, this will be the color. And for those fully dehydrated, these are the colors that's almost green. Now, when we do a doping test, we have to be very familiar with the hydration, because the result of the anti-doping test will depend on the hydration of the patient. If they're too hydrated, we have to test them again. If they're too dehydrated, we have to test them again. Maintaining hydration may help actually helps. It doesn't helps the players maintain speed and shooting during a basketball game. And this is the study I just mentioned. It's very important to inform the athletes and the staff on the importance of hydration. I used to play basketball many years ago in the 70s. In fact, my colleagues who are speakers in this webinar, if you combine their age, that's the age I'm in. Okay, combine Mark, Adrian, and Fran's age, that's the age I'm in. The time I used to play basketball, for the whole practice session, we were not allowed to drink water. This was in the 70s. Of course, over the years, we found out that that was not healthy. Next slide, please. Factors influencing hydration, of course, is water, the carbohydrate, the sodium, and the sodium. Now, in the 1970s, the well-respected scientific journal Lancet mentioned that the discovery of the sodium glucose pump in absorption is probably the most important sports science discovery of the century. And I think the Gatorade formula is based on initially the carbohydrate was not just for energy, replacement of energy, but it was for helping out the absorption of the fluid. And then you have the sodium. Again, it has to be the right ratios, or else it will be more of a hypertonic solution, and it might just add to your dehydration than add to your hydration. Next slide, please. So what are our recommendations before exercise? 5 to 7 milliliters per kilogram, 4 hours before exercise. I personally tell them 3 hours before exercise. Even your pre-game meal should be 3 hours before exercise. And then an hour before exercise, that's when we use the snacks with a high carbohydrate intake. During exercises, because by then, if you've been with the team a lot, you know the individual sweat rates, and you have a plan for each of your players. And after exercise, this is the recovery of fluids that I suggest. Again, additional sodium will depend on the individual responses to dehydration. Water provides fluid. In fact, any activity below 1 hour, I think water is enough. For high-intensity activities, though, approaching 1 hour, I would suggest a sports drink. It provides enough fluid and carbohydrates. You try to replace your sweat loss with within 2 to 3% of baseline weight. As I mentioned, that important study is they found out in basketball, at least, at 2% dehydration, your basketball skills start to deteriorate. You try to replace the weight loss of fluid before you start your next practice or your next game. You would want the specific ratios of sodium and potassium with your fluid, just so that you can retain and not actually be hypertonic and just actually release fluid into your interstitial, to your gastrointestinal tract, making it more dehydrated. And to do this, a rough estimate is to weigh before and after activities and know your sweat rate. Like I said, very basic. Monitor your urine color and listen to your body, and don't ignore your thirst. For the younger age group, though, I would not rely on thirst at all to monitor their state of hydration. Next slide, please. Now, when do you time it? Again, like I said, the usual basketball player, whether he's a student in a university, school, or a professional, with other things involved, you have your endorsements, you have your other activities, your other commitments, and then you have strength and conditioning in the morning, you have weights, you have cardiovascular, and then your practice. The usual basketball player is always pressed for time. So it's very important that you time the meals and your nutrient intake. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Eat according to the time needs of the activity ahead. Performance will be very important with that. I personally tell them their pre-game meal should be 3 hours before. Some people say 4 hours, but for personal, I believe, and there's some studies that show 3 hours might be ideal. And then we just have snacks right an hour before the game. Now, I think you have to instill on your athletes that they have regular times of meals. It's not different per day. Have them regular breakfast, regular lunch, regular dinner, and then just adjust accordingly what your other activities are. Next slide. Performance and recovery will definitely depend on the timing if your nutrition. Like a pre-game meal 1 hour before a game is not really that effective. In fact, you might have some gastrointestinal discomfort during the game if you have a pre-game meal an hour before. It also depends, like I said, on your different activities. For the younger age group, there's studies. For the professionals, there are other commitments. Next slide, please. And it's day to day. You have to change it. But I feel having a structure will help them. It can't be always changing, especially during competition time when you have in the Olympics or in the World Cup, well, you have 2 to 3 weeks of various activities. Having a fixed time would help. Next slide, please. The pre-game, these are the snacks before training and games, 30 minutes. But my meal, the main meal, I would say 3 hours before. Next slide. During its 2 to 3 hours of training per day, I would have snacks available during training. And during games, what I do is we have, in the teams I'm involved in, we have gels. I specifically formulated the gels, and we give them at halftime. We give them at the start of the fourth quarter, especially for those. What my teams do is they log the minutes per game of each athlete, and then depending on that minute, we give them the fixed amount of gels. I've seen the New Zealand team have Slurpees. To each his own, and to what will agree with your athletes. Next slide, please. Post-game, immediately, like I said, for my teams, we get them in the locker room. We don't wait for everybody to shower and then go to the restaurant. We usually have the post-game meals inside the locker room within 45 minutes. And after that, they're on their own. They either go back to their dorms or eat, or go back to their homes and eat. But it's very important they have a fixed amount of nutrients and fluids within the first 45 minutes after the game. Next slide, please. This is just a diagram on how it is. You have wake up, you have breakfast, you have snack, you have lunch. Now, I think it's recommended that you have more frequent meals during the day than just 2 or 3 big meals. The snacks, I think, are very important for recovery. Next slide. After lunch, and this is the usual practice after lunch, and then the post game after your 2 to 5 practice, or your 5 to 7 practice, or whenever your practice is. Next slide, please. Again, for pre-games, and this is by the nutrition statement done in 2016, in 2012, 2004. For green main, it's carbohydrates. You maximize glycogen stores. The lesser glycogen stores you have, the lesser intensity, whether it's in practice or in games. It improves endurance. Next slide. Fluids, as I stated earlier, it's very important to replace the losses from activity, and it keeps your body cool, euthermic. Next slide, please. And then electrolytes, it helps retains the fluid consumes, and the microelectrolytes also help with your muscular contraction. Next slide, please. Your post-game meals, again, carbohydrates is very important. Fluids also very important, and then electrolytes as mentioned. Again, like I said earlier on, next slide, for the post-game meal, protein, I think, is very important. That's why I feel very simple protein recovery is a chocolate milk, aside from your sport drink. It can stimulate protein synthesis because basketball is a very active game. You can have some muscle breakdown somewhere along the way, and the protein within the first 45 minutes that you intake can help with the muscle repair, remodeling, and adaptation. Next slide, please. During training camp or game day, this is a sample of nutrient timing. Next slide. You increase your carbs if you have higher intensity days, when you have twice a day practice right before, a week before the competition, you increase your carbs. You focus on, as you said, 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. Now, I had a problem during the last World Championships when the team went to me and they complained. I'm not going to mention which team it is, but they actually medaled. They complained. These are the sources of carbs. Like I said, the starchy carbs I prefer, and then the fruits and the fruit juices. But to continue my story, they wanted their carbs gluten-free. Now, I believe you don't need gluten-free. You don't need gluten-free meals if you're not gluten intolerant. It will only help if you're gluten intolerant, and that's a personal belief. But I did not argue with them. I did not show them. So I went to the hotel where they were billeted in, and I talked to the chef, and I arranged that all their starchy food would be gluten-free. I don't know if it helped them, but like I said, this team medaled, and maybe it worked for them. Next slide, please. Also, maybe the athletes were just used to the taste of a gluten-free meal. This is a landmark study in 1980 by Castile. It just shows the effect of diet, high carbohydrate diet with muscle glycogen or starch. High carbohydrate diet would have higher storage of glycogen. That's why high carb diet is recommended in high intensity activities. Next slide, please. If you have a low carbohydrate diet, the glycogen decreases markedly over time. And for athletics, this would impair on your performance over more than an hour. Next slide. Recovery days or days after a game, again, very important. We used to not mind recovery, but right now, recovery is one of the prime things we should in our athletes, especially with way things are going. If you're playing in a bubble, if you're playing one game after the other. Now with home and away games in international basketball, it's 2 games, 1 day apart. So recovery is very important. Next slide, please. Again, this is where protein is very important in recovery. Pre-game, not too much, but I emphasize on easily digestible, high-grade protein for recovery. Next slide. And this is about 1 gram per pound per day. This is about, if you're 200 pounds, 200 grams of protein per day over the next, over 2 to 4 hours. And high quality protein, like I said, is recommended. These are the meats, the poultry, the fish, the eggs. If you're considering vegetables, maybe soy would probably be the only one approximating them in its acids of high quality protein. All the other vegetables, although good for fiber and other nutrients and other vitamins, for the amino acids, they probably lack what your high-grade proteins give. Next slide. Thank you, and if there are any questions, I guess we'll be answering them in a while. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. It was really nice to have the science, and then also for you to weave in your applied experience as well. And we did have a question about chocolate milk, and you did cover that as well. So that question has been answered. So let's move on to our next presentation. We've got 3 very experienced sports professionals that work alongside top basketball players in the United Kingdom. So firstly, we have Mark. Mark is the head coach at the Loughborough men's basketball team and has achieved a substantial amount of success as a coach since 2013. Joining Mark is Adrian. Adrian is the current strength and conditioning lead for the men's and women's basketball team and the tennis programme at Loughborough University, as I said, based here in the United Kingdom. And last but by no means least, we have Fran Baldwin, who is currently undergoing her Masters in Sport and Exercise Nutrition and is the Performance Nutrition for basketball, netball and tennis. So collectively, Mark, Adrian and Fran are going to talk about coaching, strength and conditioning and nutrition and how what they do they put into practice. So it's over to you guys. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Becca, and thanks to GSSI, and you guys are world leading in what you do, and it's good to be involved in this morning, and well, morning for us, evening for you guys, and these webinars are a clear example of why you guys are world leading, and these education and development is awesome. So, massive thanks to Dr. Canlis and laying the table for us with the detailed information, and we just want to talk about what we do. And let me just preface this by saying there's so many different ways with nutrition in basketball to do it. It's a multi-dimensional, ever-evolving thing. So this is just sharing some of our experiences, and we're especially during these times. It's an ever-evolving field, and we just want to talk about how we actually bring it to life at Loughborough, and ultimately how do we make a difference. So I'm going to dive in looking at from a coaching standpoint, how bigger picture stuff and how we actually deal with players in terms of nutrition. And then Adrian's going to follow that up with all things S&C and how that complements the process of better nutrition in basketball. And then Fran's going to jump in with some examples with what we actually do with the players. So hopefully there's some takeaways for everybody. And I work with pro players. I work with university players. I've worked with national team players at under 18s and under 20s. And it's a similar approach across all levels. This stuff is important. This stuff really does impact winning. It impacts performance. So do you invest the level of time similarly to everything else that you're doing to make that difference? So if we open up with the first slide, we talk about so where do you start? So as a coach, where do you begin? You want players to do better with nutrition. You want to support them more as a coach. You want to change their behaviors a little bit. So how can you actually make a player listen to you? And as a coach, I often think about that. Well, why do players listen to us? It's a good question to ask yourself. And my role as a coach is to make this stuff important, to make it valued, to make practitioners be able to have a voice. So for Adrian and Fran in their roles, to make the players see that they are the head coach in their discipline, in their area, and they can make a difference just as much as me. So that's partly my role as a coach, and there has to be complete clarity. So I just want to put you guys in this scenario. If you can imagine, you are on top of a skyscraper, and opposite you is an identical skyscraper, same height. If you can imagine, there is £1 million. Over here it's pounds. I don't know what your currency is over there, but a lot of money. Imagine there's a lot of money on that other skyscraper. The only way to get to that money is to cross this little orange plank of wood, which is the width of your shoe. Meaning if you go down, but in order to get that money, would you really cross that plank of wood in order to get the money? Maybe some people, maybe probably not. Okay, now if we go to the next slide, let's change the scenario. Now your family is on the other skyscraper. the only way to save your family is to cross that very same plank of wood. How many people would do that? Most people would, right? So all we've changed there is the purpose. And that kind of brings to life the power of purpose. And we've shared this with our players and our team. And it's all about connect them with something that powerful in their environment. And that's what we try to do with nutrition. That's what we try to do with S&C. That's what we try to do with our program. Okay, so we call that the power of purpose. Do they have something that they believe in, and we're all aligned in that, and we have a bigger vision? So, and then you need to challenge them. They all have goals and aspirations. Do their behaviors match those aspirations? So if we go to the next slide, we just talk about our purpose at Loughborough is to be transformational, right? And I know that's a buzzword, and everybody's trying to be transformational, and we're trying to win alongside changing people's lives. And the next slide, these are the two kind of quotes that we use a lot in terms of Loughborough, in terms of our bigger purpose. A sporting experience so positive, it's life shaping. And we talk a ton about life. So every interaction we have with players, we're mindful, and these two things are at the forefront. So we need to be preparing them for, some guys go off and continue playing after their university and go and play pro. Some will be a pro in something else in their life, but continue playing. And then obviously working with national teams and the pro level guys, it's about winning. It's about making a difference. It's about making an impact. So we try to be noble-minded as coaches and practitioners, that we're always sowing seeds. We're never really going to get the finished product there and then. What to do with working with our athletes is educate. Look for those aha moments with anything nutrition-wise, where they're like, that makes sense. That makes sense now. So every interaction, we're about doing that. So if we move to the next slide, how do you get there? So what do? You want to reach those aha moments where they actually change your behavior in terms of nutrition. And this is the hard part. You know, how do you make it actually stick? Now, the obvious is they know that this is gonna help performance. This is gonna help you have the ability to impact winning. It's gonna help you progress in your career. It's gonna help you have a longer career. You know, all of these things from an S&C nutrition standpoint, we want to add years to their career and to continue playing. If you have bad body management, bad nutrition, your career is going to be much shorter. That's the nature of the beast. So I often talk about, they're not going to need a jump shot in 20 years' time, but they are going to need to know how to fuel, how to hydrate, all the things that Doctor was talking about, and ultimately how to manage their time, how to do the right thing, how to eat at the right time, everything that Doctor was talking about. And we want to educate them in that process. So that's what we talk about, life after Loughborough, and this is all connected. So how do we get there? The goal is to reach optimal performance, right? Every single day, whether you're in practice, whether you're in game, you're trying to have optimal performance, you're trying to perform on demand. They need to know what it takes to win, why we're doing what we're doing. So what we do at Loughborough, if we go to the next slide, we create a performance plan. So bigger picture is they need to know what we're about, why we're doing what we're doing, and we share this with players, but most importantly, it helps guide us as a staff into what we're doing daily. And I don't expect you to read all this, but just to bring a couple things to the forefront. There's always an overriding vision. So we talked about that, a sporting experience so positive, it's life-shaping. We have outcome goals in the next layer. So we start very big, and then it breaks down and gets more detailed. If we flip back to that slide previously, yeah. Outcome goals is just, what do you want to achieve? Process goals is about what matters most to help you achieve that. Areas of emphasis then breaks down a little further. What are the practical ways to do it? Then you get into deliverables. So how can I help the process? How can I provide more support? Contribution statements, that's what staff are then held accountable for. And it helps give complete clarity, complete transparency, but it allows high accountability. So the performance plan is just about where it gives guide rails for staff, for coaches, for practitioners. How can I feed into this bigger picture? So the next slide. For me as a coach and for all staff, it's KYP, know your personnel. So what is actually in the room? Start with that. Is it small and fast players? Is it slow and fat players? That's gonna determine what you actually do from a nutritional standpoint. So knock onto that is, what's your style of play going to be? So if you have a small team that are really fast, you're going to play a different brand of basketball than a large team that play really slow. Now with that comes different level of fueling, different demands on the sport. So what it takes to win and what you do from a nutritional standpoint are very ever moving, and then the demands of that style is obviously something that you have to consider in the decisions that you make. So and as Doctor mentioned, some players will need to gain weight in order to make more of an impact. Some might need to lose weight. Some might need to maintain their weight, which are all contributing factors to then what you need to decide what to do from a nutritional standpoint. And the fact that as a coach, bear in mind, the schedule is important. Is it one game a week? Is it multiple games a week? Are you building up to one game, or as Doctor mentioned, is it about recovery? Is it a game Monday, a game Wednesday, a game Friday? Do you have to recover? Is it a back-to-back? And I know Fran will talk about that a little bit later. So what is the priority? That has to be at the forefront. And then where do you play? Is it a hot environment? Is it a cold environment? That's going to impact hydration, all of those types of things. So multidisciplinary factors. So the process from a performance plan and a head coach, I need to figure out purely what do the players actually need. So in terms of a needs-based approach, they're all very different. All the players are so different. We can't have every athlete doing the exact same thing, because they don't all need the exact same thing. And more importantly, they have a different level of education and experience with nutrition. So some people have more of an interest in that, maybe. Some people have had education in it, maybe. And you need to understand that. Some people have never done anything nutrition-wise. So you might get a group of 12 players that all have different levels of experience in terms of dealing and handling nutrition and their behaviors with that. So from a coaching standpoint, assume they know nothing. It's easy for coaches. We make assumptions. Oh, they should know that. They should know better. Well, maybe they've just never experienced it before, and we need to be. So we always talk about players are doing the best they can with what they know. So don't assume they know everything, and make sure you're educational in that standpoint. So one other thing about players is they are always going to do what they value most. So in terms of their nutritional habits, sleep, hydration, fueling, they're going to do what they value most. So our role as coaches is to influence what they value. So if we stand there and say, do this, do this, do this, that might not stick. But if we influence and educate and say, this is why it's important, then we change. So our role is to influence what they value. So how do we do that? We need to have consistent conversations. So I talk about a very easy who plus why equals what and the how. Who are they and why are they in the room? So who and why equals then you can then decide what are you going to do with them and how are you going to go about it. So if we go to the next slide and we talk about what's next, actually bringing it to life, this, from my standpoint, this is some of the bigger picture stuff. Me as a coach, I need to think about the plan, and that needs to be at the forefront. It needs to be a clear purpose. If we go to the next slide, I need to make sure they understand the why and the demands of their sport. And ultimately, we must make sure what we're doing fits the demands of their style and what's needed from them. And then we get into the right. How do we actually do it? Which Adrian and Fran are about to dive into. So I'm going to hand over to Fran to talk about S&C and how that complements the process, and then Fran's going to jump in with some of the nutritional values with what we do with the team. So Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks, Dr. Canlas. That was fantastic, and it's actually set us up beautifully for how we carry on. So what I'm going to do is endeavor to explain how my role impacts the program alongside Fran, alongside Mark, and obviously taking into account everything Mark's just said. So if we go to the next slide, please. Perfect, and then maybe again, just so that the image pops up. Okay, we'll carry on anyway. So yeah, perfect, thank you. As you can see here, it says idea. We then sit down as a group, we plan, and then hopefully we finish with a positive action. In team sport, we know as an interdisciplinary team, so Mark, myself, Fran as a nutritionist, our psychologist, that sport in season is absolutely, like, we have to be absolutely reactive. There are curveballs thrown at us on a weekly and on a daily basis. That can be down to player availability, who's got niggles from the weekend, or who's got a small injury that needs managing. Mark then has scouting reports for the opposition, and that potentially changes how we may want to execute a game plan on the weekend. We get matches that get rescheduled where we think we got busy weeks coming up, and then that week ends up being completely typical as opposed to being really busy. So that alters how we plan. But the list goes on, it's endless. But at this point where we sit down, and this is normally at the end of the season, once we've reviewed how we achieved or executed our previous performance plan, we sit down, and at this point our planning and our ideas are absolutely meticulous. So just to reiterate, in season stuff is very reactive, but there are things that we can definitely plan for. And this includes, as Mark mentioned, knowing your personnel, and then trying to identify what the strengths and weaknesses are of who we currently have. And then Mark and the assistant coach, Liam, will sit down and think, right, how can we aim to improve this roster? And I'll get to my point on strength and conditioning when we get there, but it's what types of players make up our team, including the ones that we're hopefully bringing in. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And then obviously what we have in the room dictates our style of play, as Mark said. So like Mark said, you wouldn't try and play a fast, quick game with a bunch of massive guys, slow, really physical guys. And alternatively, you wouldn't try and bully teams if you had a team full of wings and guards who were nippy and fast. So when we sit down and do this planning process, and Mark tells us how he sees the team playing, because he knows how the roster is going to look, he decides how we're going to play. Everything is geared towards that. So if we go to the next slide, please. So if we go back to knowing your personnel, this is where I'll give an active working example of how we can work as an effective interdisciplinary team. So including myself as the strength and conditioning coach and Fran as the nutritionist. Mark, I don't know if you guys would have seen it, but on the performance plan, Mark states very clearly that he wants our bigs, so our 4s and 5s, he wants them to run fast, rim to rim, and he wants them to do that frequently. So not only do they need to run fast, they need to do that over and over again throughout a game. And the theme is actually very similar for our guards, who need to be able to rack really quickly or fill lanes to provide options, and they need to do that frequently throughout the game. So this is a challenge from a coaching perspective. So Mark's hoping that these guys can do this every game throughout the whole season, but then provides a challenge to myself as a strength and conditioning practitioner, and then to Fran as the nutritionist. So we know that Dr. Canlas touched on it, but we know that basketball is made up of high intensity bursts of work interspersed with aerobic stuff. So We know that in basketball, there is a sprint around every 39 seconds, and a sprint we can characterize as a high intensity movement. And we know that these bouts last between 1.7 to 2.1 seconds, which based off of the diagnostics we've run here in pre-season, we know that our guys, especially our fastest, can cover 10 to 15 meters, even 20 meters in that time. So if we're talking about full court transitions, they're basically covering the whole court in that time. So we need to be able to prepare them from a physiological perspective to be able to do this. So when it comes to strength and conditioning, over lockdown here, everyone reverted to running long distances at very slow paces, which is fantastic to build our base. Building our base absolutely allows us to recover between high intensity efforts, allows us to recover between training sessions, between games. So it's definitely necessary to have that. But we could be missing the target when it comes to preparing them adequately for basketball. And in particular, those winning actions, such as closing out, such as our containment defense, such as rim running. So all of those actions last under 6 seconds. So we need to make sure that when we get closer to pre-season or closer to in-season, once that base is absolutely ticked off, we're more specific with our conditioning strategies. And this is where myself and Fran come in, and that I will change the intensity or I will try and alter how we do things on court before they get to the coach. So a lot of the work will be very explosive, with a lot of intent and a lot of intensity. And how Fran can help in with this is their fueling strategies, what potential supplements they could add to their diets or to their daily routines to help these high intensity efforts, and not only to help them, but to make sure that they can repeat them as well. The next thing that we had to consider, especially over lockdown, was the guys basically didn't have access to a court until, I mean, Mark may have to correct me on this, but it was, I think, maybe a week or two before they actually started coming back to university. And because most of the work they were doing was long and slow aerobic based work, one of the worries I had and Mark and Fran and all of us had in the IDT was that they hadn't had much exposure to full court work. In essence, they hadn't had exposure to running fast and doing that repeatedly. And for anyone who's informed on this provides a big risk, not only just because it's hard and the guys are going to find it physically taxing, but in terms of soft tissue injury risk, such as hamstrings, calves, quads, etc. We need to make sure that it was my responsibility and everyone else's responsibility to make sure that the guys were absolutely ready to come back to university, where Mark's going to put them through their training schedule, which was very progressive, to be able to run full court. So one of the tactics we employed is before the boys arrived, they had a 6-week progressive program where I asked them to run progressive distances at progressive speeds, just so that we knew that over the weeks, the guys were being exposed to higher speeds every time. So we know that, right, these guys, their hamstrings, their calves, their Achilles, their quads have all become more accustomed to running faster over gradually increasing distances. And this work was painfully boring, I'm sure. And like Mark said, we had to educate to make sure the guys knew the why behind why we were doing this. But if anyone's seen the news and seen the data, it's the NFL, the Bundesliga, the Premier League, their return to sport has just shown us how injuries have soared and skyrocketed, especially those soft tissue ones, because nothing replaces playing the game itself and training at high intensity every day. We've been very lucky. We've had very little soft tissue injury that were unavoidable. But it's definitely down to how Mark bought into the process behind what Fran and myself and Tim, our psychologist, were suggesting. And it's just been great to see that the guys have really thrived in the environment because they've got through all that work. So I think, just to put it into context, before we even went full court and had them running maximally, I think up to 6 weeks before. So they'd been doing progressive work for 6 weeks before we even got them running at max speed, which is, it may be very, what would you call it, conservative, but I just think it's better to be that way, undercook a few people than overcook the vast majority of them. And we get these soft tissue injuries, and then our player availability just plummets. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this, you'll see a weekly planner basically, and this is pretty consistent at the moment with how our weeks are looking, especially as our season begins to start. Everything is geared towards that Saturday where it's game day. And if you just look closely, you'll see that there's green rectangles, which is where we'll have license to push the physical envelope. Yellow, where it's moderate, but we'll still push them a bit. And then there's red, where there's very low physical output, and it's very, like, the day is incredibly, there's no legacy of that session on the players. They come in, they do the work, they get out. So we like using the phrase, get in, get better, get out. So like I say, everything works back from the Saturday, and we try and undulate our load to make sure that we're optimally prepared for the game on the Saturday. So I'll explain this in a second. So on the Monday, in season, this is flexible, but at the moment, this is where the guys get their main lower body force stimulus from me in the gym. And then they have a yellow training session that evening where we can push them a bit, but it's not marked key focus where he's trying to get the most out of them. The reason why we go green on S&C that day in the gym is because it's the furthest one away from game day, which means it gives them the most amount of time to recover before they play. Tuesday on court's our biggest session. So if you follow that curve, it's high on the Monday, high on the Tuesday, because they go hard on court. And then Wednesday, we plummet, so we drop the load. So if you look at it like a line graph, so it goes up, and then it drops on Wednesday. And that's a low day, where in the gym, they'll come in and do body management work, where the focus includes ticking off a lot of capacity-based work, where we're trying to improve the soft tissue's ability to tolerate high intensity effort. So capacity areas include stuff like around the triceps suri, so calves, tib anterior, soleus, hamstrings, groins, glutes, etc. So stuff to protect below and above the knee, and a lot of trunk work as well. So training the core to be four-dimensional and work through rotation, through lateral flexion, through extension and flexion. And then on court they do very little. Thursday we start going up again. So if we've gone Monday high, Tuesday high, Wednesday's really low, Thursday starts building again. So we increase it up again, where they haven't got any S&C, and we hammer them on court. And then Friday they'll come into the gym and do a very low volume session, but where the purpose behind it is they'll come in and just move the bar or move the weights with as much intent as possible. So in other words, we get them in, the volume's really low, and they just try and move the bar with as much speed as possible, because we're trying to get them to feel explosive and get those positive neural adaptations prior to a game, and it just exposes them to moving stuff fast. And research suggests that work like this has a potential effect for the work later in the day, so that team practice, and even potentially 24 to 48 hours after. So that is the strategy we try and implement to try and get the best out of them to peak before we play the game on the Saturday. Hopefully that explains it. So you'll find that training load can be done many different ways, but our training load looks very much like it increases, decreases on the Wednesday, where you let them recover and do pretty much nothing, and then it slowly increases again before we play the game on the Saturday. Next slide, please. So this wellness monitoring has been a fantastic tool for us, because this is how we tend to try and manage bodies on a day-to-day basis. This is how I know in the gym and Mark knows on court, that when we can really push the guys and push that physical envelope, as I was mentioning, and really try and stick to that load monitoring program, or it also identifies when we should back off with specific individuals. So as a wellness monitoring tool, our physiology team report to Mark and the rest of the interdisciplinary team every day about every single player and how they are feeling that day compared to also what they felt in the past. So we found that it's actually a great way for the players to, while it's not anonymous, they do it on their own and in their own private time to submit how they're feeling at that moment in time. We get stress markers, we get soreness markers, we get sleep markers, and we get injury markers. But then on top of that, we also try and collect, we try and break down some of these things. So for stress, we'll look at academic stress, we'll look at general stress from day-to-day life. And while you might look at this and ask why, the key thing behind this all is it informs decisions and informs conversations. I think the most useful ones are, for us as an IDT, are when we see that someone's had 3 or 4 hours sleep, we know that the risk of injury almost, I think it's 1.7 to 2 times the risk of injury when someone gets less than 6 hours sleep. And this is critical for all of us to understand as an IDT. So this informs Mark pre-training to go and have those conversations with those guys to see if they're okay, or to see if this is a constant trend. if I give you the example of soreness, we know that guys will be sore after their biggest days on court, and that's where people like Fran and myself have to be on it in terms of making sure Fran will make sure that they're fully hydrated, that they're recovering properly with their fueling strategies. And in the gym, it just tells me soreness is a good thing, that they're adapting, but also tells me, right, we could be at a potentially higher risk of injury at this point, so maybe we should dial things back. So it's just very good to know exactly where we stand with the players every day, and it also gives us that personal touch every day when we see them. I think that's it from me. Hopefully that was useful, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Fran has to say for you guys.
Hello, yes. You've obviously heard all the wealth of information and planning and time that goes into speaking to our athletes and gathering this information so that we know exactly where they're at. And I use all that information to try and help ensure that these guys ultimately, when they come to game day, are the team you hate to play against, but a team you want to be part of. This is one of our process goals. This is what we're striving for, and this is what helps to direct me in my interventions with the guys alongside all of that information. So ultimately, for our athletes to be that team, to be the team you hate to play against, we need them to be playing at a relentless pace, and in order to do that, they need to be fueled, they need to be hydrated, and they need to recover well from training sessions, from Adrian's S&C program, and also from games as well. We quite often, when we're in the height of season, have games on a Wednesday, a Saturday, and sometimes a Sunday as well. If those guys are not recovering from the Wednesday game, they're not going to perform as well at the weekend. So if we today, what I'm going to run through is just our focus on game day most in the majority, just because if I talk to you about injury prevention and rehab and illness and all that jazz, we would be here all day. So we're going to focus a little bit on real life examples of what we've done with our guys to enhance their nutrition on game day. So if you could go to the next slide for me. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the recommendations and the theory behind it, because Dr. Canlas did a fantastic job of going into great detail for us about what the research shows for basketball players and athletes to be fueled. But you can see just some of the recommendations that I've pulled out for fueling for basketball players prior to game day. So carbohydrate recommendations, avoiding high fat and high fiber foods because it may delay gastric emptying or upset their stomach, which ultimately we really don't want them having upset stomachs on game day. And also during the game, the fueling recommendations are for carbohydrates, not necessarily recommended for exercise that's under 1 hour, but as Dr. Canlas said, it's likely that the players actually will end up be exercising for over an hour, even if the game is only 40 to 48 minutes, depending on which country you're playing. They also have warm-ups if they have any additional time, etc. So that's kind of our recommendations for fueling. If we go to the next part, you'll be able to see the recommendations for hydration. Again, very dependent on the individual, what works well for them and their sweat rate, and also quite generic in terms of recommendations. So if you look at 1.5 times the amount of fluid loss, that's quite generic if you said that to an athlete, because we need to do that extra step and highlight what the fluid loss is. So that can be difficult to implement. If we go to the next part, please, you'll also be able to see the recommendations for post-game, which Dr. Canlas explained beautifully for us. So they're all of the theory, all the recommendations, all the research, and that's fantastic. But unless you come from a nutrition background, that can be pretty difficult to understand and to implement into your day-to-day nutrition. I know very few people who would be able to tell me exactly what their fluid losses in an hour's basketball game. I know very few people who would be able to tell me what 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate 1 to 4 hours pre-exercise looks like. And that's my job. Ultimately, I'm there to translate that information from all the research and the recommendations into something that our athletes understand. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of some of the information that we provide to the athletes. So this was an infographic that I provided to our athletes as a reminder as to what they should be consuming, or what the recommendations are for them to be prepared, to be fueled and to be hydrated on a game day. Now, this is worth noting that this is a general recommendation. I will work with our athletes on a one-to-one basis and work out what works best for them. So when we provide this to them, it's acting as a reminder. It should stimulate that thought process a little bit of what we've already discussed. So pre-game, pretty standard for everyone, try to avoid high-fat spicy foods. 3 to 4 hours before, they want to consume a small mixed meal with carbs, colour, protein and fluids. But like Dr. Canlas said, some of the athletes will prefer to eat 4 hours before, some of them will eat 3 hours before. Some of my athletes really struggle to eat prior to a game. They get extremely nervous, they feel nauseous. So it's my job then to help facilitate what a nutrition strategy for them that means they're adequately fueled, but also doesn't combat or enhance that nausea. So you'll notice that on the infographic there is a suggestion of half-time fast-release carbohydrates, which for those of you that spied the less than an hour recommendation, for if the exercise is less than an hour, the recommendation isn't that you necessarily take on board carbohydrate, and not all of our players will play a full 40 minutes. In fact, very few of them do, so it's unlikely that they'll be playing a huge amount with substitutions. But what I found is often our athletes actually would like to eat at half-time, whether it be a psychological thing, whether it be a comfort, whether it's something they've always done. So I pop those ideas of snacks on there for them at half-time to guide their choices, to enable them to make decisions that are possibly more appropriate than potentially taking on board protein at halftime. We would want to focus on carbohydrate. And also for those guys that struggle to fuel prior to the game, they having a top up at halftime for them might actually be the difference between them really flagging in the second half, or the last 2 quarters, or them doing really, really well. So this is a very generic infographic, as I said. It was based on our double header weekend. So the idea being that this is what they would implement on game day. The recovery, therefore, being really, really important. So immediately after the game, we're looking for them to get a carb-rich snack in, protein-rich snack in, and fluids. And like Dr. Canlas, I'm a big fan of chocolate milk, and our guys also, thankfully, are big fans of chocolate milk. They love getting some chocolate milk post game. So that's a great source of recovery in nutrition for them. And then, unfortunately, unlike Dr. Canlas's teams, we can't get a recovery meal to our athletes straight away in the locker room. We don't quite have the catering facilities for them, especially at the minute with COVID. So it's down to the guys to try and get the carbs, colour, protein and fluids in after a game. So what we try and ask them to do is make sure that they are always prepped, that they've got food with them, or that we have an itinerary ready for them in terms of where their meals are going to be if they're away on a double header weekend. So that gives you a good idea of something that I would share with the guys based on food. Whilst it shows food, it's based on the nutrient recommendations in the research. If we go to the next slide. So the green boxes highlight to our guys what our non-negotiables are. So working with student athletes, working with 18 to 25-year-old men, some of them won't necessarily take on board all of these, and that's not saying anything against the particular guys that we have. It's just a lot of information. So those guys that maybe don't want to do all of this that's on the page, or they can't cope with all that information, I highlight to them the green boxes are our non-negotiables. That's exactly what we should be expecting you to do on game day. If you're not doing that, you need to be speaking to me about kind of how you're modifying that to suit you. Next slide, please. And it's all well and good me saying this and setting out those non-negotiables and what those expectations are, but I think it's worth pointing out that there are many, many barriers to performance and particularly to nutrition. So what we kind of discuss in our IDT and looking at our athletes is that athletes will have a number of barriers, and this will be different for every individual. So for example, athletes who may not have a water bottle, they may not have kitchen equipment, so they can't prep food in advance. They may not have the cooking skills that enable them to boil pasta, add in a protein sauce, add in a vegetable sauce. Those guys that won't, so we kind of split them into 3 categories of can't, won't, don't know how. Those guys that won't, like Mark said, they might not be fussed. They don't care what they're having for dinner. They don't see how nutrition affects their basketball, so they won't bother with it, which, as much as it pains me, sometimes we have to accept and work around. The guys that don't know how, this is probably quite a large majority of our student athletes who have come in away from home for the first time. They're coming to live in Loughborough at 18, and maybe they don't have the nutrition knowledge, or they don't have the cooking skills. Mum, dad, grandparents, guardians, parents, carers have all cooked for them for many years, and they've suddenly rocked up in Loughborough and gone, I don't know how to make spaghetti bolognese, but I want to eat it. Or I don't know how to make chicken and rice, but I want to eat it. And often they'll do whatever they can to make sure they get food because they're hungry, and that quite often involves dialing the local takeout. So what we need to identify is those guys that don't know how, and work to support them. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just give you some examples of some of the interventions or some of the actions that we've taken in the last year to help those individuals that have got particular barriers. And like I say, some of these guys might have a barrier from each section, and it might take several interventions for us to have any kind of impact. So if we've identified someone who is just lacking the knowledge or doesn't know how to fuel themselves effectively, I'll have one-to-one appointments with those guys. I'll have consultations with them, and we'll talk through areas of nutrition in more depth, and I'll give them some examples of how they can go about cooking certain things. So whether that be with a recipe, whether that be that at the minute it'll be via Zoom, I work through a recipe with them and cook it with them. As I've shown you some infographics, so educating the guys as to areas of nutrition, so whether it be illness prevention and helping their immune system later in the winter, or whether it be game day nutrition or hydration. Sometimes just popping an infographic on the WhatsApp group that we have is really powerful. We're also extremely lucky at Loughborough to have a fantastic elite athlete centre, which is a hotel and restaurant, and their head chef there, Varun, is wonderful and has come down and done some cooking workshops with our guys and our female basketballers, and shown them how to chop an onion effectively, showing them how to skin a fish. So we've been extremely lucky to be able to offer that to some of our players as well. And just things, small reminders at the end of practice go a long way in educating our athletes about nutrition. For athletes who can't, or they struggle because they don't have the means or the skills or the equipment, we've something I've done previously with the women's basketball team is organise a post-training snack rota. So each training session, this was obviously pre-COVID, but each training session a different player would bring in carbohydrate-based snacks, and because of the number of players in the squad, it would mean that every 2 weeks or so they would pay maybe £5 towards the post-training snack, and everyone gets a snack after each training session. So that's a good way of kind of, one, emphasising to the individuals the importance of post-training snacks, but also two, enabling them, those that are busy, those that are on limited budget, those that aren't able to get to the shops as easily, to still be able to have those post-training snacks. Water bottles for game days is something we are very fortunate to be able to provide to our team, but equally so, if you're haven't got the budget to be able to buy water bottles, can you highlight to your athletes where the water fountains are in the building? I know it sounds really silly, but I've had athletes who have gone hours without water because they don't know where to fill their water bottle. So pointing those things out can be a real game changer. Itinerary for away games, as we've said, I try and work really closely with Mark to make sure that our guys know what their itinerary is. Mark is fantastic and has a calendar available to the guys so that they can see what time they're supposed to be where, and I try and slot in there and make sure that we've got our meals and our snacks in there as well if we're providing meals for the guys, or if they need to be organising it themselves. We also do have a supplement partnership at Loughborough, so we do, if they need it to top up their nutrition, we have that available to us. And a big IDT approach to rehab and injury recovery enables our athletes who are off court and not injured, that enables them to come back to the court hopefully in a safe but swift manner. And then final section for athletes that won't, and as much as it pains me, you may never win the battle against them, or battle against the fact that they don't value nutrition. We just try and emphasize to them that nutrition is really important in basketball and in sport and in life. So we'll organise team meals, we'll encourage them to go out for team meals, again, pre-COVID when they were all allowed to socialise together. Aligned IDT messaging. So our physio, our psychologist, our AVP, our S&C coach, Mark, our head coach, we will all try, if there is a particular focus that one of our disciplines is looking at, we will try and align our messaging when we're seeing the guys, whether it be in a physio appointment, whether it be in a nutritional appointment, whether it be on court, to ensure that they're getting that repeated messaging and it's emphasised to them just how important it is. And then a big thing also that Mark's fantastic at is celebrating our guys who are working really hard on their nutrition, or who are taking the time to engage with me, or are making strides to enhance their own performance through whether it be S&C or nutrition, or working with Tim, our mental performance coach. So I believe AVP is going to actually explain how this looks in S&C as well. So these are some examples of how it would look in nutrition. But if we go on to the next slide, AVP is going to explain S&C. Hopefully Adrian's going to be on this side, otherwise.
There we are, we're in. Right, so it's a bit messy on this one, but I think the key thing here, the key messages to take away is with like nutrition, like the sport, strength and conditioning, we do have people who don't know how and need education. We have people who can't and need enabling, and we have people who won't, although they're very much a unicorn type of person, especially with Loughborough basketball. It's rare. And we need to emphasize why the stuff's important. So if we put it into practice, for people who don't know how, a lot of these guys know where their strengths and weaknesses are, but from a physical perspective, but just have no clue how to achieve it. So this just presents itself as people who either have a poor training age or have poor gym literacy. So that's my job then in the gym to one, direct their programming based off of, as we get to the next point, based off of what their strengths and weaknesses are. And then where I put that in the year is where the more like the art of coaching comes in, or the art of design comes in. And then the gym literacy is just hammering home movement quality over the intensity of the movement. So make sure that they're doing these things properly, rather than just forcing through something that they probably can't lift. If we go to can't and we enable, we identify this mainly through physical testing and screening, and that's done with myself and the physiotherapist. We go through a whole batch of screens and physical tests that underpin the winning actions we're going after on court. So we'll speed test them, we'll do a change of direction test, we'll do jump testing, we'll do capacity testing. And these are this for example, the screenings are box tickers to say, right, this person's ready to play, or this person can train. But then the physical testing tells us, right, this person, athlete A, is poor 0 to 5 meters or 0 to 10 meters, or athlete B ticks the boxes 0 to 5 and 0 to 10 compared to the norms of the NBA or compared to the norms of the British Basketball League, but they can't change direction. So that's where our programming gets its direction from, and that's how we make it as individualized as possible for each person. Then you get the won'ts. Again, like I say, really rare in England, or not in England, I guess, rare in Loughborough with the basketball squad. But these people present themselves as players who won't or are reluctant to go to the gym on days where there's hard training, because they aren't well educated on how the week needs to be structured in terms of training load. And if you think back to that the weekly schedule where the different colors for different activities popped up where I was explaining training load, a common misnomer is that if you got a hard court session or a moderate court session, you should do no S&C. It's get all the hard days out of the way and hammer them on those days. And then when they have a day off, that's when you let them absolutely recover. It's important for their body to realize, right, this is what Mark's taught me on court. This is what I've done in the gym. It allows the brain to make those neural connections with all the new information they've taken on board. But if you then badger that with a hard training session or a hard gym session, the body doesn't have time to recover. And then you get also those who are just scared of getting too sore close to a game. And again, that's just about educating them on what causes soreness and what soreness is. And again, this doesn't happen often. And I often, just like Mark said, we assume that they don't know anything. So we just keep reiterating this every week, every day and as many interactions that we can, so that the guys are just getting these positive messages reinforced all the time. And that's the same for all three of those, not just the won'ts. And yeah, that's me. Back to Fran.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of information there, and we've looked at a range of different interventions, both from nutrition, S&C, even coaching perspective. But I just wanted to share with you this screenshots. These are taken from our men's basketball WhatsApp chat last year, and it is a slow process. Although we put all these interventions in place and we work hard, it takes time to change people's habits. And this was actually the day after I shared the game day infographic that I showed with you guys. I shared it with the players as a reminder of their kind of game day habits. And just to make sure that they were prepped for the weekend, I asked them if anyone had got their snacks ready, and absolutely none of them had a snack for post-training, let alone thought about what snacks they were having for the game day the next day, which was a little disheartening. So I suggested to them that they needed to head to the supermarket at some point and make sure that they were fully fueled, because if they got stuck on the M1, which is the major motorway in England, if they got stuck on the M1 and they had no food, what were they going to do to fuel prior to the game, because they wouldn't have opportunity to stop at the services. And lo and behold, the stars aligned, and they happened, unfortunately, to sit on the M1, the major motorway, for several hours prior to their game on the Saturday, and had to literally go straight into the sports hall and play and warm up and play the game, so had no opportunity to buy any food. But thankfully they'd listened and they had all got their snacks with them, so you can see some photos of their snacks. So this was quite a nice little scenario for me, selfishly, because it reinforced the messaging that I'd suggested to them the night before about being prepared and having those carbohydrate based snacks ahead of game day. But not so great for Mark and the team sitting on the M1 for several hours. So if we head to the next slide, just a few final points from me is, like Mark's mentioned it before, we at Loughborough strive to try and give our athletes a sporting experience so positive it's life-saving. That's our goal. But it's important to acknowledge that whatever you do in your programs, whether you have a nutritionist or not, whether it's with your coach, the knowledge and skills that you're giving to those athletes, whether it be nutrition, whether it be S&C, whether it be on the court, they're things that they can take outside. So these are just a couple of key moments from our last few years at Loughborough Basketball. You can see we were very fortunate to have the cooking workshop with our elite athlete centre, and the guys really enjoyed that. And this is something that they will take away and they will remember, and hopefully they will remember how to skin a fish and chop an onion for many years to come. So that's one of my favourite parts of our job, is the fact that we also look to help our athletes for their life after Loughborough, alongside their life with us playing sport. So next slide, just to wrap up from my perspective. It's important, if you have got a nutritionist who's working within the program, my big advice would be to take direction from the program goals for your nutrition intervention. So if you're going to try and ensure athletes are any of the numerous things that they can be from a nutrition perspective, what are your goals? Then have a look at what the team goals, what the coach is aiming for, and what will align to that. Next point would be that, remember, the players eat food, not nutrients. They're very unlikely to know how many grams of carbohydrate are in a banana. So it may be that that you need a nutritionist to come in and provide those real life food examples for them. Next part. And there are numerous barriers to changing nutrition behaviour. It's likely different for each athlete. We've spoken about the can't, the won'ts, the don't know hows, and there's probably a combination of all of those for each athlete. So highlighting and getting to know, having those conversations, whether it be over Zoom or on the court with those athletes, has really helped me to highlight and get to know our personnel and know our athletes' barriers, and hopefully help them to overcome it. And then my final point would be that if we just go to the next part, it doesn't always have to be a workshop or a PowerPoint. From a nutrition perspective, some of the most powerful interventions I've had has been taking athletes to the supermarket and pointing out the high protein sources that they need to be consuming post training or post game, or showing them the cheaper way of having tinned fruit rather than fresh fruit, so that it lasts longer, because they're living on a budget and they're not having any fruit or veg. So yeah, it doesn't always have to be a workshop or a PowerPoint. There are numerous ways that you can influence an individual's nutrition. And I think Mark's going to wrap it up if we go to the next slide.
Yeah, such a ton of rich information there, and I just want to wrap it up with a kind of final reflection, and all the educate, the enable, the emphasize. When we want to be life shaping, just make it fun, make it joyous, make it something that they're actually going to remember. Like what's actually going to stick with them in terms of nutrition, and what are they actually going to remember and implement into their life and their nutrition habits. And I understand we're fortunate in our environment to have what we have. That's not the same everywhere. So you might be lucky enough to have multiple staff. It might just be you. It might just be you as a coach with your players. So the one thing that we have in common, no matter the environment, is there are athletes and players in front of you, and you have the opportunity to make a difference. So whether you're a part of 8 staff with a nutritionist and S&C, or whether it's you and your players, educate, have those interactions, have those moments, have those conversations. We are in a relationship-based business, different business in terms of coaching. And the last point I want to make with this slide is this is our reality. So all the arrows there indicate all the different players and athletes that you work with, all different size, different shapes. They're all got different goals, and they're all focused in different directions. And then the big green arrow is us as a program. Where do we want to go? What direction do we want to go in? And then if we flip to the next slide, our job as a staff is to align everybody. So all those different shapes and sizes, all those different athletes, all the different members of staff, can we align them to all be traveling in the same direction? Can we influence and just turn them? Can we make them just go in the same direction as the bigger picture? And that's our responsibility, to try and do that every single day. And every day is an opportunity to do that. So everything is about creating that alignment. That starts with the performance plan. And then the magic is bringing it to life every single day. So embrace it, enjoy it. You're going to mess it up. You're going to make mistakes. Failure doesn't exist. It's only learning and growth. So we appreciate your time and attention, and want to just celebrate everybody jumping on the call to get better. So back to Becca.
Thanks, guys. Honestly, it was so fascinating. I could sit here for ages and listen to all 4 of you. Some of the key things that I've personally taken away is individualization, education, and that education takes a long time if we want to change behavior. Thinking about values and what the purpose is. And then Mark, I think you made a great point at the end about just making it fun. And so yeah, thank you. You've really enlightened or enhanced my knowledge on this topic this morning or this afternoon. We are quite tight for time, but I would like to ask a couple of questions, and then maybe if I could follow up with you after the specific questions if we don't have time. The first question, if I could direct it to you, Adrian, you mentioned about monitoring stress levels. How do you monitor that within your teams? Do you use an app, or is it just manually like keeping a diary?
So we're lucky enough to have an app that tracks this. It's almost, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention names or anything like that, but it's an app that we use that sends a notification to the player's phone. It pops up and it will give them a whole wellness score, or like a whole wellness questionnaire, including their sleep, soreness, academic stress, general stress, sports stress. And that gets reported to a dashboard on the same application that Mark, myself, Fran, and the whole group the IDT, have access to. And that will get reported to Mark every day by the physiologist who works with us. So it's not on top of the app. It's not just that. It's conversations as well that Mark will have with the players, and I will have the players in the gym.
Yeah, so people that don't have access to an app, they could do it manually by using questionnaire recording.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that.
So there are several
sorry.
avenues you can go for that. You got like Google Forms or OneDrive forms that allow you to do the same thing, and it's just to create a form online and give the players the link. And it doesn't mean it has to be an app. It gives you a raw data export, and you can just see what they put there.
Yeah, so that's a great tip. Thank you. Doc, question for you. What's the earliest age for young athletes to take sports nutrition seriously?
Oh,
Good question.
wow, yeah, that's a very good question. Rebecca, before I answer that, can I thank GSSI and you, Rebecca, for giving me the opportunity? And can I thank Coach Mark, Coach Adrian, and Mystic Fran for giving me, I've been in basketball for almost 40 years, and opportunities like this, you still learn some pearls, and I've learned a lot of pearls from you guys and Loughborough University. I just want to thank you for reminding us that when we deal with college athletes, it's not just basketball. We're trying to get them, prepare them for the life after. Okay, the question is how young? I guess when they have their growth spurt. Okay, the problem there is in the sports medicine world right now, there is a debate on sports-specific activities at early ages. So I would suggest when they have their growth spurt is more important. And that's when the competitive basketball comes in, which is about 14 to 16 years old. I would think that. I don't know if Adrian or Mark or Fran have any other thoughts about that.
I'd agree in the sense that, I'd agree in terms of up until that age, looking to adopt a balanced diet, eating a little bit of everything and anything, variety, moderation, plenty of fruit and veg. And then after that point, if they're starting to take their sport really seriously, whether it be basketball or whatever else, they can start to look at more strategies to help in their performance.
That's a great add, Fran. Thanks.
I'll just add in.
So sure, Mark, go ahead.
Sorry, the point I made about what we all have in front of us is the opportunity to make a difference. So no matter the age, it's those conversations. You can always educate. We're still educating now, even with our pro guys. We're educating, even with the youngest junior people we work with. You still have that opportunity. So okay, at different levels and age and stage, you get potentially more support and opportunity to do more things. But at any age, make a difference and have those conversations.
Thanks, Mark. As I said, we don't have that much time for questions, so I think we might have to leave it there for today. But would just like to say again, such a big thank you to all four of you. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody on the call has enjoyed it as well. I'd also just like to say thanks to everyone who's attended, and just a reminder to the attendees that if you've attended more than 3 webinars, you will be receiving a GSSI certificate. And we do actually have another webinar in the series that's coming up on the 13th of October. It's going to be at the same time, and we're going to have a roundtable discussion with some really special guests from the basketball community, but specifically from the Philippines. So please join us again on the 13th of October. So lastly, just like to say thanks. One last thing, what I'm always going to remember is get in, get better, get out. I've written that down and I'm always going to remember that. So thanks to our 4 speakers, and we'll see all the attendees again on the 13th of October.
Thank you.